Hey everybody, TM Punk here, welcoming you to another edition of the Wrestle Wrant, where I dissect the weird, wacky, wonderful, and often worrying world of professional wrestling. No matter who you are or what you do, there are things in life you'll look back on with regret. Things you wish you'd done differently, things you wish you had the courage to say, or chances that you let slip through your fingers. And the world of pro wrestling is no different. In fact, when it comes to life inside the squared circle, even when the stars seem to align to produce something wonderful, it can often end in disaster. So today, I'm going to be counting down the biggest missed opportunities in wrestling. Now, a lot of you will be expecting to see the invasion angle feature somewhere on this list. But in a swerve turn of Vince Russo-like proportions, I've decided to exclude it from the countdown. And there's a few reasons for this. 1. It's far too obvious. 2. There's already a load of stuff being said about it. And 3. It's something I plan to feature in more detail in a later video. So if that's something you want to see, you'll just have to hit subscribe and stay tuned. And yes, I'm aware of the irony in missing the opportunity to talk about a missed opportunity. But I've made that joke now, so you can't. Kicking things off at number 7, it's Goldberg in the WWE. Now this one seems particularly relevant right now, as unless you've been living under a rock for the last few weeks, you'll know that Goldberg has now returned to the WWE after a 12-year absence. And whilst it's far too early to pass judgment on his current run, it's hard to see how it could go any worse than his first. Now it feels like I'm stepping out of some kind of wrestling closet by saying this, but at the height of the Monday Night Wars, my wrestling brand of choice was WCW, and a big part of that was Bill Goldberg. That doesn't mean I didn't like the WWF guys. They were great. I loved the beer swilling, bird flipping antics of Stone Cold, and The Rock's verbal beatdowns. But what made Goldberg so special is that he didn't need any gimmickry or catchphrases to get the job done. He just snarled and shadowboxed his way to the ring, destroyed his opponent in less time than it takes me to seduce your mum, and stoically marched to the back like a silent assassin. In fact, throughout his initial WCW run, he barely said a single word, except "who's next" on camera and "more money please" off it. But this is what made his relative failure in WWE so frustrating. There was already an established blueprint for booking Goldberg, already a proven way to make him look like a monster. Few WCW fans would argue that the Goldberg character ran out of steam after his initial winning streak was ended, so when he did make the jump to WWE on a short-term one-year deal, it seemed tailor-made to get the best out of him. So what could go wrong? Well, quite a lot as it happens. Things started well enough for him, as he was thrown straight into a feud with The Rock, and even went over the great one at Backlash 2003. Soon after, he entered the hunt for the World Heavyweight title, and this is where the problems began. Goldberg had always been at his best in short squash matches against lower card talent. It was the most effective way to make him look like a beast and conceal his limitations as a worker. But if you're going to put him in long, main event caliber matches against top level guys, his flaws are going to be exposed for all to see. He received his first title shot inside the Elimination Chamber at that year's SummerSlam, and quickly disposed of Shawn Michaels, Randy Orton and Chris Jericho. The championship seemed within his grasp, until reigning champion Triple H hit him with a sledgehammer and stole the win. Now, the concept of the dastardly heel resorting to foul play to overcome the babyface is nothing new, but in this case, it just fell a little flat. Fans had been conditioned to see Goldberg as an unstoppable monster for the best part of 6 years. Plus, we'd just seen him single-handedly dispatch 3 of the company's top guys. Yet suddenly, we were supposed to accept the idea that he could be stopped with a single shot from a tool your dad keeps in his garden shed. It just seemed to destroy everything we thought we knew about him. Now, it should be noted that Triple H was at the height of his shovel mania phase, and I understand his desire to protect his spot. But it's a decision that seems even more ludicrous when you consider he dropped the belt to Goldberg in a one-on-one match at the following month's Unforgiven. I mean, if you're going to lose your title, but want to look strong in the process, surely it's better to do so in a multi-man gimmick match like the Elimination Chamber than do it cleanly in a straight wrestling match. And whilst it was cool to see Goldberg reunited with a big gold belt, he went on to drop it back to Triple H just 3 months later. At this point, Goldberg had been with the company for less than a year, but had already wrestled and beaten pretty much everyone on Raw, and won and lost the world title. He still had 3 months left to run on his contract, but what else was left for him to do? Luckily, salvation seemed to appear in the rather intimidating shape of Brock Lesnar. He and Goldberg shared many similarities. Both wrestled with hard-hitting, smash-mouth styles, both had legitimate sporting backgrounds, and both were booked in a similar no-nonsense fashion. In fact, many consider Lesnar, who had been groomed as the future of WWE, to be Goldberg's natural successor, and a proposed WrestleMania encounter between the two was a genuine dream match. It would also be the perfect way for Goldberg to bow out of the company and pass the torch to the next generation. Unfortunately, as the match drew nearer, Lesnar revealed that he too would be leaving WWE after Mania, and with neither man planning to stick around, the entire feud was rendered pretty pointless. Even if they had produced a 5-star match for the ages that night, which they definitely didn't, the fans still wouldn't have cared. In fact, both men were booed out of the building, probably not what Goldberg had imagined when he signed up 1 year earlier. The history books will tell you that Goldberg got the win over Lesnar that night, but he was even denied his final WrestleMania moment when he was flattened by guest referee Steve Austin during the post-match celebration. It was kind of a metaphor for his entire run. Moving on to missed opportunity number 6, Christian's comeback. At its best, wrestling is just simple storytelling. Good versus evil, right versus wrong, light versus dark. And because we've seen these stories played out hundreds of times before, they can become a little predictable. But that's not always a bad thing. When you watch an Indiana Jones movie, it doesn't matter what perils our hero has to face, because you know that good will ultimately prevail. It's just conventional storytelling logic, and it gives the audience the satisfying payoff they've been waiting for. Unfortunately, when it comes to WWE, the logical conclusion isn't always the one we get. Back in 2005, Christian was one of the most over wrestlers in the entire company. Considered to be one of the most accomplished workers around, he'd already dominated the tag team division for years, had successful runs as both a European and IC champ, and enjoyed memorable moments with Hall of Fame worthy talent such as Trish Stratus and Chris Jericho. But despite all this, he found himself unable to break the glass ceiling and ascend to main event level. Seeking a new challenge, Christian made the switch to TNA in November of that year, and quickly achieved his ambition of winning a world title. Christian would stick with the group for nearly 4 years, and established himself as an elite performer, capturing the TNA title for a second time, and feuding with workers the calibre of Kurt Angle, AJ Styles and Samoa Joe. And so it was no surprise that WWE reached out to him for a return. In the early part of 2009, Christian's former tag team partner and on-screen brother Edge was feuding with WWE champion Jeff Hardy. Seeking to give Edge the upper hand, an unknown assailant began to target Hardy in a series of unprovoked attacks, and talk soon turned to the identity of the mystery man. The smart money was on Christian, as it just made sense from a storytelling point of view. Plus, it would have presumably led to a high-profile feud between him and Hardy. But WWE had other ideas. Instead of Christian, they revealed Jeff's brother Matt Hardy as the man responsible, which would just lead to another forgettable feud between the two siblings. In fact, fans had to wait another 2 months before Christian returned to TV, and even then, it was as part of the much maligned ECW brand. He did go on to capture the ECW title soon after, but that was almost the WWE equivalent of an honourable mention. Christian would eventually make his way to SmackDown and would go on to win the World Heavyweight title on 2 occasions. But when you consider that both reigns lasted a combined 5 weeks, it's hardly the stuff of legend. After dropping the belt to Randy Orton, Christian was slipped down the card, and before retiring in 2014, found himself stuck in the mid-card pursuing the Intercontinental title. The very same spot he held before leaving the company some 9 years earlier. He probably wondered why he bothered. In at number 5, we have the WCW reboot. As I said earlier in this video, I was a huge fan of WCW, and stuck with the promotion into the new millennium, even after many other fans and wrestlers had defected to the WWF. In April of 2000, head booker Kevin Sullivan was relieved of his duties, and WCW announced plans to wipe the slate clean with a company-wide reboot. On the one hand, this was an incredibly risky venture. Abandoning all current storylines and stripping all established champions of their titles could have further alienated an already pretty disenchanted fanbase. However, at that point, the product had become so tired and convoluted, it was precisely the kind of decisive action needed to breathe life back into the company. However, like everything else WCW tried to stop the rot, the whole thing was a complete disaster. The entire idea of the angle was to push WCW's younger, unheralded talent as stars of the future, and also to portray the established veterans as relics who needed to step aside. But somehow, their roles got reversed. The younger guys, or new blood as they became known, came across as cowardly, bitter, disrespectful heels, whereas the older guys, or Millionaires Club, were booked as noble warriors, heroically defending their legacies against a band of ungrateful upstarts. And if that all felt strangely familiar to WCW fans, then it should. Also, many of the feuds created were complete mismatches. Whilst it was great to see a guy like Billy Kidman feature in a prominent role, fans were never going to believe he was a legitimate threat to the immortal, all-conquering, flag-waving uberface that was Hulk Hogan, especially when just 2 years earlier, Kidman was booked as a recovering heroin addict. I'm not making that up. Worse still, many of the so-called new superstars brought in to spearhead the initiative were guys we'd seen wrestle for other promotions for almost 10 years. It was like being given a second-hand toy as a kid. At first you're thrilled with it, but after a while you realise it's got bits missing and teeth marks all over it. Perhaps the angle could have worked if given a bit more time, but WCW abandoned the reboot concept after just 3 months, and everything went back to being the same mess it had been before. Nice one, guys. Next up in the number 4 slot, we have the New World Order 2002. Now I know I said I wasn't going to talk about the invasion angle, but I just need to touch on it for one moment. One of the big criticisms of that whole mess was the lack of star power on the side of WCW. In fact, with the exception of Booker T and Diamond Dallas Page, very few recognisable faces had jumped ship, and instead of seeing the likes of Ric Flair, Goldberg and Sting bring the fight to the WWF, fans had to settle for guys like Shawn Stasiak and Bill DeMott. That's why the prospect of the original NWO joining the company in 2002 was so tantalising. Not only were Hulk Hogan, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash synonymous with WCW, but they were also big names in the WWF, so fans of both companies were thrilled to see them back. In addition, the NWO had been one of the biggest money spinners in wrestling history, and with the power of the WWF machine behind it, there was surely no limit to how far they could go. In the weeks leading up to their return, Vince McMahon had put the group over as a gang of renegade thugs, hell-bent on destroying the WWF from within. But within minutes of their debut at the No Way Out pay-per-view, all that excitement and anticipation seemed to be undone. Instead of establishing themselves as the feared mercenaries we were expecting, they delivered a bizarre face promo in which they thanked the WWF and its fans for their continued support. Hardly the kind of villainous behaviour we'd been promised. The group continued to be featured prominently over the coming months, but Kevin Nash was permanently injured. Hogan controversially turned himself face and left the group during a program with The Rock, and Scott Hall did what he always did back then, got drunk and got fired. With 2 of its core members gone, the group struggled to maintain any momentum, and the addition of new recruits such as X-Pac, Big Show, Booker T and even Shawn Michaels just served to water the whole thing down. Eventually the group was disbanded by Vince McMahon himself just 5 months after their debut. A sad end for one of the greatest factions in wrestling history. Taking the number 3 position, it's John Cena versus The Nexus. The John Cena heel turn is the wrestling equivalent of a unicorn. We'd all like to see one, but deep down we know it's never going to happen. There have been many opportunities for Cena to make the jump to the dark side though, but none were more frustrating than his 2010 feud with The Nexus. For those who don't know, The Nexus were a heel stable made up of young, up-and-coming wrestlers from the first season of NXT. Led by Wade Barrett, the group invaded the main roster in June of 2010 and destroyed everything in their path, including wrestlers, commentators, ring announcers, and even the Monday Night Raw set. The group were booked strongly throughout the summer months, and Barrett would quickly establish himself as the top heel in the company. Unfortunately, this momentum would carry the Nexus into the path of WWE's very own knight in shining armour, and a messy collision was inevitable. Cena went on to single-handedly bury the group at that year's SummerSlam, a decision that made not only the Nexus, but also all the other talent who had worked so hard to put them over seemed weak by comparison. It was an outcome that angered and alienated other members of the locker room, and one that Cena himself has since admitted was a mistake. However, the angle would take an interesting turn at that year's Hell in a Cell, when a match was scheduled between Barrett and Cena, with the stipulation that if Cena lost, he would have to join the Nexus. Remarkably, Barrett would go on to claim the win that night, opening up a host of new possibilities. The idea of the once squeaky clean Cena reluctantly carrying out Barrett's dastardly orders was hugely intriguing, and would have not only added previously unseen depth to his character, but also helped to repair the damage done to Barrett's push at SummerSlam. Unfortunately, neither would come to pass. Cena's association with the Nexus lasted just 5 short weeks, before being kayfabe fired from the WWE. And even when he returned to the company, it was as the invincible Cena of old. It was all just a bit underwhelming. In the penultimate spot, it's Bret Hart in WCW. Now there's a lot of negativity surrounding Bret Hart's WCW run, but I don't think it was as bad as everyone makes out. Sure, he never hit the heights he did in the WWF, but he did have some memorable moments, most notably winning the WCW title in his native Canada and reforming the NWO. His inclusion on this list doesn't relate to his entire WCW tenure, but just the way he was handled in his first few months with the company. Whilst it may seem passé in 2016, back in 1997 the Montreal Screwjob was the biggest thing to ever hit the world of sports entertainment. Bret Hart was already a superstar in the WWF, but his controversial departure from the company and the heat it generated made him the hottest property in wrestling. At the time, the Monday Night War was in full swing, and many felt the momentum Bret had, coupled with the fact that many of his fans had vowed to boycott the WWF, would move the pendulum firmly in WCW's favour. Bret made his debut for the company at Starrcade 97, WCW's biggest show of the year. The main event pitted the heroic Sting against scheming WCW champion Hollywood Hogan, and the plan was for crooked referee Nick Patrick to deliver a fast count and declare Hogan the winner. Seeking to avenge the injustice he had faced in the WWF, the noble hitman would then demand the match be restarted and install himself as special guest referee, eventually raising Sting's hand in victory. On paper, it actually sounds pretty good, but for some reason, and I'll just leave this picture of Hogan here, Nick Patrick delivered a perfectly regular 3 count, which just made Bret's motivation for getting involved look a bit sad and deluded. Worse still, in his first 7 months with the company, Hart wrestled on WCW television on just 2 occasions, completely derailing his post-WWF momentum and negating his potential drawing power in the battle for rating supremacy. Prior to his arrival, WCW had been chasing his signature for nearly 18 months, so their spectacular failure to capitalise on a new acquisition seems even more bizarre. It's almost like an awkward first-time section encounter. You spend months pursuing the object of your desire, but when you're confronted with the reality of the situation, you just don't know what to do, and the whole thing ends up in a disappointing anticlimax. Bret Hart could, and should, have been WCW's golden goose. Instead, they turned him into a turkey. Finally, in our number 1 spot, we have the curious case of Steve Austin. In the early to mid-90s, a young Texan by the name of Steve Williams was signed to WCW, working under the ring name Stunning Steve Austin. He was widely considered as one of the finest workers in the company, and had already had multiple reigns as a tag team, United States and television champion. A run with a top title seemed inevitable, until a serious triceps injury forced him to the sidelines. Unfortunately, in his absence, WCW became the Hulk Hogan show, and Austin's main event credentials were dealt a serious blow. Before he could return from injury, Austin was released from his contract by WCW, with Vice President Eric Bischoff questioning Austin's ability to make money. An embittered Austin would eventually resurface in Paul Heyman's ECW, where his anarchic promo style caught the attention of the WWF. After a brief and forgettable stint as the Ringmaster, Austin would adopt the nickname Stone Cold, and soon after winning the King of the Ring 96, would transition to 3-time Royal Rumble winner, 4-time Tag Team Champion, 2-time Intercontinental Champion, 6-time World Champion, and Hall of Fame inductee. In addition, he would go on to surpass the popularity of any wrestler in modern history, and played a key role in putting WCW out of business in 2001. Love him or hate him, Eric Bischoff was behind a lot of great things in WCW. Letting Austin go was definitely not one of them. So that's all the time we have on this edition of the Wrestle Wrant. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment below and like, share and subscribe. And even if you didn't, share it anyway, so you and your mates can talk about what a douchebag I am. My name's TM Punk, you've been watching the Wrestle Wrant, and I'll see you for another real soon.